Welcome back to my BrainWise Coach. We are so excited that you've joined us for another episode. I am one of your co-hosts, Bastian.
And I'm the other co-host, Phil Dixon.
And we are so excited that you have decided to join us again on a conversation related to, really, this is part 2, Phil, where we talked last week about the art and science of effective dialogue, and we really zeroed in on active or effective listening skills. And we shared with our BrainWise friends that there were 2 other parts of effective dialogue, which were around asking great questions. And then, of course, how do we communicate or tell our perspective in a very succinct, effective way as possible? So today, we're going to be continuing that journey, and we're really going to be honing in on probably 2 parts, the last 2 parts, which is all around asking great questions. And we talked last week about open-ended question versus closed-ended questions, and then how to actually deliver some great information from our perspective. And so I want to share, before we just dive right in, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, Audible, or any of those traditional podcast areas, you are getting the full episode every Monday, where we have 45 minutes to an hour of conversation and how we can use the information to decode our life. On YouTube, we're using a bit of a different content strategy just because the audience seems to be mildly different, that we are loading the same episode, but we're splitting it into 3 segments. So we have segment 1 launching on Mondays, segment 2 on Tuesdays, and segment 3 on Wednesdays. And so that's going to be the cadence for YouTube moving forward, but the content is the same. And so if you choose to watch us on either of the platforms, you'll get the same information. We're just now going to be segmenting the content a little bit differently. So I wanted to share that on the front end, because there may be people, Phil, who are listening on YouTube and also listening on Spotify or Apple. They're going, wait a minute, am I getting different content? Content is the same. It's just simply we're splitting it differently because strategies for different channels needs to be to match the audience. And so we're going to see how it goes. If you have feedback on it, please, of course, always let us know, because we're always open to how we can make this, our show, more approachable and more accessible for all of our BrainWise friends. So with that, our 3 segments today that we're going to really unpack is the intention behind asking and telling, and why our brains might default to one or the other, the balance between the 2, how to know when to ask, when to tell, and when safety will shape both of those. And then we're going to go into probably you might call it a constructive dialogue model, a coaching model, or coaching rhythm, call it the TAPS model, tell, ask, problem, solution, that we can use in all of our relationships to help us have more effective conversation. So are you ready to dive in, Phil, to part 1?
Can't wait.
Awesome. So Phil, let's start off with, most of us think we're good communicators. And actually, I used to do a workshop where we would ask people to write down, what percentage of your time are you having conversation, whether verbal, it's written, text, email, whatever. And then what percentage of that time are those conversations actually successful? And what's fascinating about it is there's always a large gap. So we think we're good to some degree, but we're not actually probably as good in some cases. So if it's true that we are so good at conversation, Phil, why do so many of our conversations still miss the mark?
Actually, there's a big difference between how we think we are effective and how other people judge us in our effectiveness. And it's a little bit like if you ask the average person, where are you in terms of how good a driver you are? 93% say I'm way better than average. You know, we're not very good at self-judgment like that. Most of our opinions about whether we were successful or not turn out not to be true. We convince ourselves we're good and we're actually not that good. So, what's actually going on? All sorts. We're going to delve into many of them momentarily.
I love it. And I think one of the things too is probably giving a definition, Phil, of what does a successful conversation look like. And so I'll share my definition of a successful conversation. I'd be fascinated to know your definition, but I've always described it very simplistically as, that the message that I, as the deliverer, that message is delivered to the receiver in the way I intended it. Meaning that I have a message I want to deliver to you, that I want to communicate to you, and I have an intention behind it. And so I'm delivering it to you, and you understand it in the way that I intended it.
Yeah.
So what would your definition be?
So pretty much the same, but I'd step one step back and so to say, if I'm having a conversation with you and I trigger that, I'm the one that triggers at least this part of the conversation off. whose job is it to make sure that's successful, make certain that we get to that point that you were saying where we've got equal understanding of the point of what we were doing? Because my contention is whoever triggers off is also responsible for ensuring its success.
I 100% agree, especially in the dynamic of if I'm going to coach here, if I'm going to have in the work context, I'm responsible as the leader for delivering effective dialogue. I think the only time, Phil, that I would probably put maybe an asterisk there is when you're in your relationship with your significant other. It's each person's responsibility to communicate in your own way, but it's your responsibility to communicate successfully your message. And I think a lot of times we expect our spouse or our partner to understand us, and we get frustrated when that doesn't happen. But we always should in that relationship, because there's different dynamics, of course, right? We are individually responsible for how we effectively communicate to the other person. And so it's my job to make sure that when I communicate, I'm communicating in a way that my spouse understands me and vice versa.
Yeah. And it's what you intend. We're talking about all sorts of things. So let's step back a moment. Obviously, there's intent. That is, you've got an intent, whether it be, I'm going to ask you a question or I'm going to tell you something. And so the intent is different quite often. The asking a question might be, I really want an answer. There's some information I'm trying to seek. The other reason for asking a question is to make you think and to get some clarity around thought. So we've got several things going on at the same time, but a lot of it is intent. So here's the first thing. Are we clear about our intent?
Mm-hmm.
Because very often we're actually not. We've got a vague idea of what we're trying to do, as opposed to stepping back and going, what's an optimum next thing? What do I need to know? What do I need to communicate? What's the purpose of what I'm about to say?
Right.
And I will turn around. I'm going to take us slightly off to one side, but I'll bring us back.
Okay.
And that is, I elected to watch some TV yesterday. I normally don't watch much in the way of TV, but there was some important things going on. And there was last week, I don't care which side of the political spectrum you are, but there was an interesting week. So it was interesting to see what was going on. And I watched an interviewer interviewing, I think it was 3 or 4 people, about 5 each. And what was fascinating is the interviewer asked some powerful questions, but not many. And what I noticed is most of them asked a really good question. What was it that led you to that conclusion? Right. And then they added what I'll call a leading the witness question, which is, was it because you did so and so and so? Mm-hmm. Well, now, if you've been following what we talk about, that is anchoring a point into that person's brain, right?
And their intention was maybe not to anchor something, but they wanted to lead the jury in the response, probably.
Yeah, and great journalists don't do that. They're there to get the facts, get the truth as close as they can, lead the witness. And so that's one of the things I noticed again and again. Now, may they do that deliberately? Quite possibly. To me, it's not a really effective way of asking questions.
Right.
But let's assume that this person asked a really good question. And closed-ended question was, will you support what the X was? Doesn't matter. And I timed it. And this person, the politician, responded for 4.5 minutes and never answered the question.
Yeah. Called word salad.
Word salad. And I came up with an idea. I think what we should do is have a piece of software that when the interviewer asks a question, the politician's microphone goes onto mute until they press either a yes or a no button.
We might not ever hear him talk again.
Which may not be a bad thing.
Right.
And it was funny because I watched for probably about an hour before I gave up. But there wasn't one occasion when a politician actually answered yes or no to a yes/no question. And so I think we need to that's an aside, but it does illustrate the power of asking powerful questions. So again, stepping back, when you're when you're responding to something, we'll take a look at what might be going on that influences your intent. Mm-hmm. And then when you're responding, you're either going to go into a question mode or a telling mode. And again, we're going to unpack those things in a moment.
And I think it's a great example, and maybe it's a little bit of humor too, but when we're looking at that example of conversation and asking questions, that is not what we're recommending in terms of someone's response and how you should model your dialogue after, right? We're going to go into what we believe is the most effective, because I just had this image in my mind of between two spouses, particularly, let's talk me and my husband. He asks me a closed-ended question. Instead of responding with a yes or a no, I'd take him on this word salad journey. How frustrating that would be for him. And that is not a successful model for a healthy relationship. So
Not at all.
it was important to note that.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that might influence your, I'm listening, and now it's time for me to respond. What are some of the things that might be going on in my head which are going to influence that? All right.
Bias, worldview, mental model.
Bias, mental models, worldview, all of those type of things. Right. Our emotions, what's been raised by what's going on, the content, the manner, all of those things will actually cause me to have different thoughts and feelings and emotions. We have a thing called the ladder of inference, is that we hear something, we interpret it through mental models and biases and filters, and then our brains aren't very good at keeping the whole thing in mind. So we basically break it down into what's the gist of it. And even that we can't sometimes remember. So we'll make a concept and then we'll make an inference from that concept. And that's what we then tend to respond to the inference rather than what was actually said or what the data was.
That's where a lot of conflict happens.
Which is a huge amount of where conflict happens. Then we haven't spent a lot of time on this in our program so far, but we are not all one character. A set of different characters, depending on all sorts of things. And which actual character part of us is coming to the fore. We'll actually have a separate segment one of these days on how to identify your own characters. What stress level we're under. You're going to answer much more to be succinct and to the point if you're not under stress.
Right.
And if you are under stress, you're more likely to have a certain behavioral response, which will probably come out of habit. And so, again, stress level, a relationship and trust level. If part of my response is to give you some feedback we know only works if I'm both credible and trusted. So if I've got the intent to give you feedback, but I'm not credible and not trusted, you're literally wasting your time giving feedback. And then we're all got different neurodiversity approaches, difference between extrovert and introvert and all sorts of other characteristics like that. All of those things blend into, I'll call it a mashed potato, and that's clouding or helping one way or the other what our response, the intent behind our response.
And I think it leads to a good point, which we've talked about a little bit. Are we listening to understand or are we listening to respond? Oftentimes, right? And it's okay to have a response to something and we should respond, but we should be listening first to understand what is being communicated, reframe, clarify, paraphrase if necessary, and then move the conversation along the same pathway or along the same journey. I think we get into a lot of trouble as individuals sometimes because we are listening to respond, especially when emotions, stress, all the things you just described, when we're at heightened levels of that, our ability to say, wait a minute, let me take a step back and fully understand what's happening. We're instead now getting to a point of defensiveness sometimes, or trying to, okay, I need to respond to this for whatever reason, because the filters in which that we have been listening are now clouded.
And one of the filters we have is how comfortable we are with silence. Mm-hmm. Because most of us, especially in the Western world, don't feel comfortable with silence. And therefore, we feel that there's a need to fill that silence up. And there's a rule of thumb, and I think you and I know this well enough, when we are coaching or facilitating a conversation, it's okay to have silence. If you're facilitating a group, I always count to 7. If there's nothing that comes up, I'll say, okay, it's time to either ask another question or move on or whatever it might be. allowing the silence is extremely important.
Absolutely, especially if you're trying to understand or make sense of what's being communicated. Or I think a lot of times when someone is expressing or communicating their emotions behind something, that it doesn't necessarily meet the logic of what one person might be interpreting, but it's really just an opportunity to vent or to express, here's how I was feeling about this particular situation. A lot of times we want to jump in and we want to fix it or solve it, when in reality, it's just a moment to say, one, maybe nothing, be pause and be silent to allow the other person to fully express themselves, and then be able to say, I understand that may have you feeling that way. But it's interesting because I think we've all experienced this, where we try to then go to that doesn't fit logically with what we're communicating. Well, sometimes the emotional part of a conversation needs to be left to its own space to be able to say, okay, it's okay for us to experience it, and then go back after we've expressed it to, okay, now where are we trying to get to in this conversation? Because equally are as important, but the pause, I think, is oftentimes very critical in that emotional part of a conversation, to just let the space breathe for a minute, because maybe the other person needs that time to collect themselves. And that's okay. So I love it. Very good. Phil, I have one more question that for you when we talk about communication and we talk about asking versus telling. And it's in any of our conversations, why do people default to telling instead of asking?
That's a great question. We tend to have a couple of things going on. We're driven by 47 different threats, and we tend to be driven by those threats. Let's just pick a few, for example. One is going to be, if I feel like I'm got to be in control, and so the first thing I'm going to do, for some people, it's a mental model that says, if I ask you a question, you are going to assume, a theory of mind, you are going to assume, therefore, I agree with you, or I'm not very smart because I don't have an opinion. So we start as all sorts of things. Our brains are driving us the whole time there, needing to be in control, needing to prove a point, needing to be right.
Right.
All of those things are driving us. On the other hand, it's also driving us is if I've got a point of view that actually I don't feel comfortable sharing with you, I'm going to change my intent, I'm going to change my approach, or whatever it might be. If I'm actually responding, I may not know how to be purposeful if my opinion flies in the face of the opinion of the group. And there's all sorts of tests that have been done that if the group automatically turns around and pushes it back against you, it's difficult to then keep on down the track that you wanted to keep on. Again, I think probably the movie said it all. It's complicated. So when you are responding, to become more self-aware of what's going on, what is your intent, when can you do inquiry and exploration, and when do you want to actually make a point. Even when you talked about reframing, etc., that is actually, you made a choice and your intent is to reframe, to check in, to verify, all of those type of things. I would say coming back to what is your intent, and are you self-aware enough to be able to look to that intent?
No, exactly. And I think it's one of the things that's interesting about what you were describing is telling, I think, probably makes us feel safe because it does keep us in control to some degree, or at least the illusion of feeling in control. But what's fascinating about it is connection rarely grows in control. It grows in curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're asking questions, you're obviously demonstrating curiosity. When you're telling, you're demonstrating a higher degree of control in that particular instance. And both are, in terms of asking and telling information, it's important to have a balance of both. But it's certainly, when we're trying to connect with another human being, being able to ask or remain very curious about their perspective and where they're coming from is ultimately what's going to help us create a better connection with them. And so again, right. I think it goes back to, what is your intention in that particular conversation?
And not only is it your intention, but how do you want to come across?
Right.
So let's imagine a 2x2 matrix. You've never seen one of those before, I'm sure.
Nope.
No, not in our world. But if you have it on the left-hand side, how much do you tend to spend your time asking questions, right? So it's either you're low or you're high in that intent. The other one across the bottom is the degree to which you want to spend your time telling. Therefore, you could be low orientation towards that or high. So let's come up with now, if you're low asking and low telling, what's that going to come across?
Disengaged. I don't really care.
Disengaged, bland, uninterested, wimpy, whatever you want to put on it. How's it going to come across if you always spend your time in ask mode? You low tell and high ask orientation.
Probably that you're more whimsical in nature, I guess, maybe, meaning that do you really have an opinion on something? Are you able to offer good commentary, rich context to the dialogue? Or is there a confidence challenge maybe that's coming up? Would probably be some of my questions. It'd probably be very individual, but those are some of the general things that come to my mind in terms of how I would describe that person.
Absolutely. And I just, in my book, it's difficult to know. I can't get my arms around what it is you stand for, what your values are, if you're constantly asking questions. Now, unless they are questions which, by in and of their nature, actually tell me something about you, open-ended questions, I'm never going to get to know you.
Right.
So now let's look at the other side of the coin, which is if somebody is always very rarely asking questions and always telling you their opinion. And I'm sure we've all met people like that.
No doubt. I would describe it as maybe controlling to some degree, depending on what it's about. Maybe there's an over exuberance of confidence, maybe also described as somewhat arrogant in some spaces, maybe a bit more selfish or self-inclined in nature. Not that describe that person as that way, but they could be presenting themselves in that way unintentionally.
Absolutely. And you didn't add the domineering. It would be, again, what is your intent about how you want to come across?
Right.
When one of the questions we often ask is, what's the legacy you want to leave?
Yeah.
And so every time you end a conversation, walk away, you've actually added or subtracted from your legacy. So what is the legacy you want to leave with people in their mind? What do you want them to say about you? Ultimately, how would you want them to write your obituary?
Right.
You are both able to ask great questions and able to put your point of view across. And so that's what we're looking for.
Right. Which I think is a great segue into what we were going to talk about next, which is all around balance and when to ask and when to tell. So Phil, let's segue into the next kind of part of our conversation, which is all around balance and finding balance in a conversation when we are in a discussion with another person between how often we're asking great questions and how often we might be sharing or telling our perspective. So what happens in the brain when a conversation starts to feel one-sided? Like one person is doing all the talking or all of the questioning. We just described a little bit of that, but give us a recap of what might be happening in my brain as I'm listening to that part of the dialogue.
If you're listening to somebody who is always in tell mode, you probably might be listening for a little period of time, and your brain changes to, how do I get a word in edgeways?
Right.
And you're taken out of the inquiry mode in your brain into the response, listening to respond and getting an opportunity to respond. Mm-hmm. So, again, that's what's going on inside the recipient's brain. If the recipient is always being asked questions,
mm-hmm.
And again, if you're always asking me questions, and this is supposed to be a balanced two-way relationship, I'm not able to find out what your opinion is. And both occasions, our brain is taking us out of that curiosity, inquiry mode into the how do I respond mode.
I think an interesting way that I have heard, or at least I'm thinking of now in terms of describing it, is conversations like a rhythm. If you think of our heart rhythm and how we have a normal heart rate or normal rhythm, it's supposed to have fluctuation. It beats, it pause, beats. And you can see it on the EKG, how there's this rhythm that's happening. if one person is asking all of the questions or is telling all of the information, now that pulse flatlines because we're dominating the dialogue versus us keeping the rhythm in check. And I think that it's an interesting metaphor for how conversation should go is where am I in the rhythm? And if I can take a step back and maybe I need to meet what my partner is looking for in this instance or the person I'm talking to at work, how can I better meet them in the middle in this conversation so we can get back on rhythm? Because at work, and really in general, it's not just at work, but we don't like to be spoken at. We like to be spoken with. And so how can we have a better rhythm in our dialogue?
Yeah. So when I'm doing major presentations to large audiences, I will always ask the question, how many of you like to be told what to do?
Very few.
And it pretty well always goes silent for a while, and no one puts their hand up. And typically after about 5 or 8 seconds, somebody will put their hand up. In fact, I did this last week. Somebody will put their hand up and say, occasionally I do. Great. On what occasion? What are the occasions that cause you to actually want to be told what to do?
Right.
And it's typically when I don't know what to do. But quite often, nobody bothers to try and find out whether you actually know or not. They'll just launch into telling you. And so it goes typically like this. Have you tried this? Yeah, I tried that and it didn't work. Have you tried this? No, I did that and it didn't work. As opposed to saying, what have you tried?
Right.
And we'll start. Do you want to dig into that now? We could go straight into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
I know the other day you and I did a little exercise on me trying to find out when you went to vacation. We talked about open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are the single most powerful tool we all have at our disposal.
Right.
And so when you think of it, if you want to stay in curiosity, open-ended questions are the best way to do it. I don't know a way of learning when you're telling.
No, definitely not.
No, there may be that I haven't discovered. But if you want to learn something about somebody or something, ask questions.
Right.
And if you're just telling people, you're never going to learn anything.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about what are the types of open-ended questions let's think about. If we ask an open-ended question, I think we've talked about this in the past, but let's make certain we cover it again, is open-ended questions are one of the 6 journalistic questions.
Mm-hmm.
And have we covered those in the past? I think we have.
We went into why you want to be careful with using why questions.
Right.
I talked a little bit about how it might behoove us to go through a little bit of more context around great open-ended questions.
So the 6 journalistic questions are who, why, what, where, when, and how, if I remember rightly.
Mm-hmm.
Each of them has a different purpose. And again, intent. So if you want to find out a single piece of information, then where, when, and who will give you a single piece of information.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do? So when did you go to the gala last weekend?
Right.
Right? Saturday, 3:00, whenever it might have been.
6:30 to be precise.
I was guessing. So those 3 are going to give you very specific pieces of information, and it's perfectly legitimate. If that's what you need to know, then great. The other 3, what, how, and why, are much more likely to give you a richer description.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about why being very difficult because you've got tonality, implications, defensiveness all come out under why. But the how and the what, and if any of our readers want to, you and I know we've got lists of maybe 150 different questions on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're slightly different depending on what your intent. If you want to find out what somebody's vision of a solution might be,
Right.
the whole series of things there. If you're at the beginning of a conversation with somebody that you don't know, you're probably going to choose a different question set about getting to know them. If you want to help them establish what their next steps are going to be, or You're inquiring about what their next steps are going to be, the different questions. So you've got a series, and we can identify buckets. How do you create questions which are most relevant to the intent of the conversation they're in at any point in time?
Exactly. And I think just to summarize for those who may want to, a quick way to know open-ended versus closed. Closed gives you a singular response or a yes, no question. And then, of course, as Phil was describing, open-ended or a dialogue. It's an explanation of something that gives you more than just a one word or yes or no response. And obviously, there is a balance between there are sometimes we want to ask some closed-ended questions, and there should be a balance between those types of questions, Phil, and also a balance between asking and telling. And so I'm curious from your perspective, when we think about asking those great questions that you were just talking about, and then me sharing or telling my perspective, what are some cues, or when would I know that it's an appropriate time to ask a question versus maybe share some of my perspective?
First of all, what I recommend is to actually ask for that transition. I think you know me well enough now that most of the time, if I'm going to give you an opinion or some advice or tell you my opinion, whatever it might be, I will ask whether it's now's a good time. If you're on a roll and the only reason you've stopped is to think about the next thing you want to say, then it may not be appropriate for me to do anything other than keep listening or asking you questions.
Right.
So I always suggest to people that they ask. Is now, or I've got a couple of thoughts about that. Is it okay to share them with you? I think you and I actually did that maybe an hour or so ago.
We did.
And it's as far as I know, it's the single most powerful way of doing it. But let's expand a little bit on terms of open-ended questions. What do we actually mean? Because what happened is a perfectly good open-ended question, right? That tends to be backward looking. If we want to turn someone around to forward looking,
What would you do differently?
What would you do differently? What would you have happen? What do we have to make happen in order to achieve?
Right.
And they are much more, I call them positive directional questions. How do I move something into the realm of possibility in your brain? Right. And again, there's a whole series of those positive. What has to happen in order to achieve X?
Right.
So what happened, which is looking back, and why tends to take people's brains backwards. Why did you do that?
And there's ways to reframe why questions. So if you want to know why did you do it that way, you can say, what was going through your mind at that time, right? Or how did you reach that conclusion, right? Because that will give you the same information, but avoid the accusatory tone or what people might interpret as being accusatory. And I think, Phil, one of the things to remind our BrainWise friends, and this may be even a reminder for myself sometimes, my husband will probably get a kick out of this, being a coach, I have to be careful when I use those coaching style questions in conversation with my spouse because I'm not his coach, right? And this might be true for our spouse. It might be true for our significant other, right? But the relationship now, if you're a parent and you're working with your kiddos, depending on their maturity level, those are some fabulous questions to begin to get them to think. They may not have the response yet because their experience is still developing, but it's great to get them thinking of, okay, how do I directionally move forward? Okay, the past is where we are now. What would we do differently as we move forward to avoid whatever it is that just happened or to get a different outcome? But with our spouse, we have to be really careful because it's not my job to coach them. It's my job to support him, right? And to be his support system. And there may be an opportunity where he wants me to help think through something, but then that's where I need to follow your advice and say, Joey, would you like me to share, or I have some thoughts, or do you want me to help you navigate that towards that outcome? And then he'll guide me on whether or not it's an appropriate time or not to go into that dialogue. But I think it's important to share that because those questions are fabulous when used in the right context.
Yeah, and I think, I know I'm guilty of this, of leaping into a conclusion about what someone wants, about saying, what do you need from me? Always a great question, especially, and I'm sorry to be gender specific here, but those of us who tend to identify with the male side of the world tend to jump into solution and problem solving And that's not what's always required.
100%, not always what's required. My husband he can compartmentalize very well, right? So there's a box here, a box there. My husband has those boxes. He can compartmentalize very well. And then me, on the other hand, I have the opposite brain, which is everything is so interconnected. Just because we're talking about, I don't know, the fruit being on the table today, that may be connected to another experience we had in the past where the fruit wasn't on the table, or where the fruit got moved and now I can't find it and it's frustrating me and that's why it needs to be there. So there's all of these interconnected highways and pathways between things that are going on in my brain. Both brains are entirely okay because it's just how we are wired as individuals. But being able to recognize when it's the right time to have a dialogue where I might be expressing something that is maybe not entirely related to, we're trying to find out why the fruit isn't on the table, but I just need a moment to express my frustration behind it not being there. Give that person the opportunity to express it, then go back to actually solving, or the logic is what I hear a lot of times, the logical part of the conversation. Logic and emotion are sometimes opposite of each other. And so you just have to give space for the emotional part to be expressed. And then being the one who's more emotional, I have a responsibility to go, okay, I have a couple minutes to express myself, but then I need to be able to move myself on in the conversation, because we can't just sit here swirling in everything that I'm feeling, because it may not make sense. And it's not his responsibility to help me make it make sense. It's just his responsibility to acknowledge that it's there and move forward to whatever it is we're now trying to solve. So I just wanted to share that because I think it's something that a lot of times, especially in relationships, Phil, gets in the way of, am I trying to solve this? Am I not trying to solve this? Is it logic versus emotion? And being able to decipher the two and allow space for both to exist harmoniously.
And one of the things we are going to do at some point in time in the future is to explore those difference between, you described two different types of brain, basically logical and emotional. And we do know that the two hemispheres of the brain react differently. So we will explore that. But that's a subject in and of itself, and we'll do it some other day.
Absolutely. I love it. And I think people really get an interesting perspective out of it. And so far, we've shared a lot today around the balance between asking and telling information. We've talked a little bit about great open-ended questions, but let's talk a little bit about maybe some practical application outside of the tips that we've talked about thus far and shared with our BrainWise friends. You've always called it the TAPS model, or tell, ask, problem, solution. Let's spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about that particular model and how one can use it successfully when having dialogue, whether at home, at work, with friends, boss, employee, the gambit of all conversations. How does it help us?
It helps by so one of the things, I think we said this before, that the difference between a novice and an expert is a model. And it's pretty well true for everything. We gave a model just now of how to reach balance. Look at whether you're high tell, high ask. We can take that ask-tell thing in a slightly different way. So if you imagine asking and telling being opposite ends of the vertical scale, right? And on the left-hand side, you've got problem orientation. And on the right-hand side, you've got solution orientation. So that gives us 4 quadrants to look at. Again, same 2x2 matrix. Top left-hand quadrant is asking about problems.
Okay.
The top right quadrant is asking about solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we go bottom, we got the bottom left is telling about problems. And then the bottom right is telling about solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And what our brains tend to do is start off asking about the situation.
Right.
Right. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson did this really well, as I understand it. He wouldn't, when he met somebody that he knew, he wouldn't say, "How are you?" He'd say, "What seems clearer now?" It's a great open-ended question, which cuts out all the noise, the noise and the immaterial stuff to get some really interesting. So asking about what the situation. Then what we tend to do is drop down to verification. And we even talk about this in our dialogue. we drop down and say, what I understand, so your problem is what I understand. We're actually telling for confirmation what's going on. Once we've got our arms around, yes, that's the problem, that's what we're dealing with, we tend, especially in the Western world, to then hop across from the bottom left to the bottom right and say, here's your solution.
I have the magic cure.
Aren't I smart? Aren't I right? Aren't I correct? Aren't I in control? Whatever it might be, and the brain tends to reward us by going, oh my gosh, those once or twice when I've been right, I get a reward, a little hit of dopamine in the brain, and therefore I'm going to continue doing it. All right. What you now notice, if you were to draw this on a diagram, is that you've come down the left-hand side, you've gone across the bottom, you never attended anything in the top right-hand quadrant. And that's what we call the sweet spot, all right, where you start asking questions about the solution.
Right. And about how they can solve it, not necessarily.
Absolutely. And so if you are, especially if you're in a coaching mode or you're in a developmental mode at work, you've got you're a supervisor and you're helping somebody who works for you has come and said, what do you think about this? Turns out the data says something like 85% of the time when somebody says to you, how do I solve this? Or can you help me solve this? Or whatever it might be, 85% of the time, they actually have an idea on what should be done. Maybe they don't have the courage to come up with it. Maybe there's been slapped around before for not coming up with the right idea. And so what they're looking for is support or affirmation or whatever it might be. Your job as coach or developer is to help people actually explore it for themselves.
Right.
So if you work on that principle that 5 times out of 6, roughly speaking, that individual has got a good idea, at least something that might work. So your job is to dig it out. And that can be, what have you already thought of? What have you thought of? Where have you seen something like this in the past? What other things seem to work in parallel? What have you thought of and dismissed? What have you already tried?
Right.
I can keep on going for probably an hour with that question. We don't tend to practice those open-ended questions. And if you want to try something new and you're playing golf or you're playing tennis or any sport, you will go and practice it. Exactly the same as when you're trying to learn a new technique like this, practice it. And look at how much time you spend in asking open-ended questions versus telling what's going on.
Exactly. And I think you can identify in a way to help you is if there's someone on your team, in particular at work anyways, that you trust and feel comfortable, is ask for an accountability partner and say, I'm working on balancing actually asking for the solution versus always telling how to solve it. If I get off kilter, or help me understand where I'm at, right, along the journey, because they can give you a cue or a sign during dialogue or in a reflection moment. You're doing really well. I'm starting to see a better balance, or you're reverting to X or whatever it might be, because it'll allow you to get some instantaneous feedback. And I think another reason, Phil, that dawned on me is that we want to ask for the solution is that's where the most rich learning happens.
Yeah.
When I get to think about it and when I get to come up with the solution and then therefore share it, I'm going to go, wait a minute. And also ownership.
Yeah. And so a couple of things happen in our brain. So let's step back and go, what's going on in our brain? And that is, if you can get to that point where you're asking somebody to come up with their ideas and they explore. And by the way, if you're not 100% trusted, you can still use this, because what's going to happen is people will come up with, give you an idea. I think we could do X. They may not feel comfortable giving you their true idea, because they're testing you out a little bit. So quite often the first idea will come out, will say,
right.
I think we should paint the wall red. Okay, great. Now ask more. You can either drill down or ask we do. And it's those what else could we do or could you do when you get to the second, third, or maybe fourth answer, that's where something of richness is coming out.
Right.
Because now they're digging deeper, or they're getting to the point where they trust you a little more. And they'll tell you some of the maybe riskier versions of. And so don't ever just stand there and take the first one and go, great, let's move.
And if their response is, I don't know, right? Like the person responds, there is a point where we do then need to tell, because maybe they truly don't know. But one of the questions, especially for coaches or supervisor relationships, that I have always suggested is, because it's positive direction, it's saying, if you did know, what would you do?
Yeah.
Because now I'm putting you in this space of assuming that you know the answer, right? And I always believe that 90% of the time, human beings have the answers they lie within. We just need someone to help us facilitate it out, right?
Yeah.
And so by asking that particular question of the individual, it puts their brain in a more positive frame of reference to say, okay, I do know. What would I do? Now, if they respond to that question and say, I still don't know, that's probably your opportunity now to switch back to, let me share a little bit more around X, maybe not give the full answer, but then say, now based off of that, what do you think you would do?
Yeah. And so that's what we would have. If somebody says, I truly don't know, and if you ask me another open-ended question, I'm going to have to slap you.
Right.
There is a point in time when people don't know, and that's why they've come to you. But then what I would recommend is exactly what you said, and I call it getting permission to drop down. And that is, hey, is now a good time for me? I've had some experience in here. I know a couple of things that might work. Is now a good time? Yeah. So you actually just check in with somebody, because if they then say yes, now you have a charter to say, okay.
Right.
And if you possibly can, don't just give one answer, because that is an experience of me feeling told what to do. If you can give two, or better even still, three possibilities. Hey, I've seen this work in the past. I've seen this.
Right.
Now you go, that's your bottom right-hand quadrant. Now go back up to which of those three seems most appropriate in this situation.
Right. 100%.
Because what that does is it gives the recipient's brain a sense that I'm still in control. You haven't told me what to do.
Exactly. And I think, Phil, one of the things that people might be going, how do I adapt this to a relational context? Like if I'm talking with my spouse, because some of those questions I would probably personally avoid asking my husband for good reasons. But I think depending on the context, you can use the same frame of reference, but instead of it being, okay, what would you do? It could be one of the things I've always described to people, even in outside of relationships, but in marriages specifically too, is the problem that we're trying to solve. Let's take it and put it on the chair so that the problem is in front of us. And now we're going to solve the problem together. And so instead of saying, what would you do? Or why didn't you do this? Or how could, because that it creates some distance. It's what have we tried? Now, in a boss relationship, we advise staying away from we, because it creates joint accountability for the solution when we need the other person to own it, right? But in marriage, oftentimes, now, if it's something I personally need to work on, then I need to own up to that. But if there's a financial situation that we need to solve, right, we both can have ownership in that. Maybe I need to do a better job of communicating my spending or vice versa. But we can solve that together and saying, okay, we have a financial challenge we need to solve. What have we done in the past that's worked? What have we not tried that we think we could try? And now it becomes a collaborative session focused on the problem that's in the chair. And I think that's critical in these dialogues, because a lot of times those are the conversations around finance, intimacy, other things that become very heated and can sometimes get a bit out of whack in terms of where we want the conversation to go. And it's a lot of times because the emotions, I know because a lot of times they're mine, there's things that are crossing all over the place. But if you actually physically talk about the problem is here and that's what we're solving in this chair, it makes it less about you and less about me and how that is going versus that's the problem. Now let's solve it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we step back and become aware of where we are in one of those four quadrants and what's most appropriate next.
Yeah.
I've just found that model. I didn't to give credit that I first came across that in a book by David Rock called Quiet Leadership. And I've used that many times since.
I love it.
And that question you asked about, if you did know, what would you do, is a single most powerful question. And I saw that in an operation probably 30 years ago. There's a guy called Tim Galway, who was a professional tennis coach. And he would say to people, what's the biggest issue you have? And they would say, I don't know, serving or backhand or whatever it might be. And he'd ask the question as they were playing, if you did know, what would you do? And they go, oh, I'd do it this way, bang. And so it works both for intellectual, cognitive skills, and it seems like it works for motor skills as well.
I love it. I think it's really good. I think we've shared a lot of good, rich context and also BrainWise tips along this journey, Phil, for all of our BrainWise friends on how do we have a more effective dialogue and really diving into the art and science of effective communication. And I think we're always going to be constant learners, life learners, and evolving this, because even in relationships, when you've been married to someone for a number of years, we all are changing every day as human beings. And so we need to remain curious, continue to get to know our spouse. And so how we communicated a couple of years ago may not be the way we need to communicate with them today. Same thing at work. You might have worked with somebody for a number of years and they're changing too. And you have new people being introduced. And so how are you constantly learning to communicate more effectively with those that are around you? Because ultimately you're going to get a better outcome if you focus on how can I show up better in these dialogues. I think, Phil, how would you, before we go to our BrainWise moments from the week, or unwise perhaps, because those are always fun to talk about, how would you summarize what we've talked about today? I'll give a few reflection questions for folks, and then we'll have a little fun to end our episode today and go through our BrainWise or unwise moments.
So I think probably pick one of the models that we've talked about and just visualize it. Or if anybody wants to have a document that we send, happy to send them and share the documents that we have around this. Become aware of where you are at any point in time and what is your intent to do next. And then do you have one of these tools to actually make it more effective? I'd say those three things.
I love it. Yeah, no, I think it's great. And a couple of our reflection questions to add on to that today on how we might be able to use this from our listeners' perspective is, when do I feel safest to speak and when do I shut down? What emotion drives my urge to tell rather than ask? How can I use curiosity to diffuse my next conflict? That's a really interesting question, actually. Who in my life needs me to pause more before responding? And how can I show support even when I disagree? Which is extremely difficult sometimes to do, but so important, especially in relationships. So pick one of those questions, pick one of our models that we talked about today, as Phil was describing, and where is it that you can begin to use that information to help you improve along this journey? So Phil, before we end the episode, let's talk about our BrainWise or our Brain Unwise moments from the week. And I'll go ahead and share because mine just happened today, in fact. So I guess this is a reward moment for me, but over the last I'm a baker, for those who don't know, and I enjoy sourdough baking. I enjoy regular baking, bread, cookies, cakes, pies, the whole gambit of it all. And I thoroughly enjoy doing it. Now, I also have to be careful how much I do it because I can't eat it all or I'll be as big as a hippopotamus. So that's number one. That's a BrainWise moment or tip for myself, is don't eat it all. But over the last number of probably about 12, maybe 16 months, I have been making bread in a bread maker as well as making it in like a sourdough. I've been able to make traditional classic white bread in my bread maker, no problem. But I've had a really difficult time making whole wheat bread in the bread maker. It always falls when it goes to the baking part. It does a great job with rising. It rises really high and all of this. And I think it was related to my hydration level in terms of how much moisture. Well, today I successfully made a loaf of whole wheat bread that did not fall. So now the true test will come in. How does it taste? Because it's a little bit different recipe, but I'm sure it'll be fabulous. But it rose, it didn't fall, it looks beautiful, it smells delicious in here, so I can't wait to cut it open at lunchtime and have a little piece of bread. But that's my BrainWise moment. I did something fun this morning, and I learned how to finally make a whole wheat loaf of bread without it falling.
Congratulations. And I look forward to one of these days coming down, tasting it, because I do like regular, good old bread and butter.
I do too. I've got some for you whenever you're ready.
You got it. So my BrainWise moment occurred actually on Saturday.
Okay.
And that is, some things happened, and I arrived back home on, Kathy's been away all week, and I arrived home back on Saturday, and I didn't have the ingredients planned for my dinner. And so I had to look in what was available. We still don't have a refrigerator that works yet. The pickings were small, but what I did find was some frozen ground beef and an onion and a potato. And I went, what has to happen to make dinner out of these three things?
You are resourceful.
And so what I said to myself, and Kathy reminded me, she said, so what you had was just burger and chips in a slightly different fashion. And that was exactly right. I ground up the beef, put some onion in, did that, cut up the potato, made some mashed potato. And so I had ground beef and onion on mashed potato. It was a perfect, satisfactory dinner, probably even improved slightly more by some good old 2017 Zinfandel.
I love it. That sounds delicious, very resourceful also. Very good. BrainWise friends, we're so glad you continue to go on this journey with us. We hope to see you next week as we continue on our dialogue of decoding our life through the lens of neuroscience and a little bit of behavioral science sprinkled in. Join us on Thursday for our Neuroscience Digest episode. We've got a lot in store for you. And until then, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.